A wise man once said, horsepower sells cars, but torque wins races. The latter can be argued into infinity, but what has been overwhelmingly true for the last 60 years, since the dawn of the muscle car era, is that advertised horsepower sells cars. When manufacturers release spec sheets for their latest and greatest offerings, usually the first metric that's shown is horsepower and torque, followed by acceleration times and cornering Gs, and then useless information on crash test ratings and fuel consumption. In essence, the most important number for our ever-decreasing attention spans is the horsepower the engine produces. Where it gets interesting is the horsepower number you're advertised and promised from the factory and the number you leave the dealership with can differ dramatically, in some cases underrepresented, where it seems the car shouldn't perform as good as it does, and in other cases overrepresented, where the numbers and performance aren't achievable in the real world. With the popularity of measuring tools like dynamometers and GPS performance timers, the accuracy and validity of published power figures for certain cars have come into question. Manufacturers like McLaren, Porsche, BMW, and the list goes on have been suspected of conservatively rating their power figures for years now, in certain cases 100 horsepower or more below its real-world figure. And many enthusiasts and owners are scratching their head as to why. On this 30th episode of Explain, we will dive into the dark arts of measuring power and how you could be driving home with more than you thought or leaving lots on the table. In order to understand why some cars are overrated and underrated, it is essential to understand the concepts of horsepower and torque and how manufacturers measure them. Torque is the measurement of force applied on a rotational axis. Just like when you use a wrench to tighten a bolt, you're applying force on an axis which is measured in pound-feet or Newton meters. The more force applied, the higher the torque, or the longer the distance from the axis, the higher the torque as well, just like using a cheater bar to loosen a stubborn bolt. To measure the torque output of an engine, you'll need a dynamometer, which is connected to the engine's crankshaft and uses a strain gauge to measure the torque and a reluctor wheel to measure the revolutions per minute of the engine, and from those two measurements, it calculates brake horsepower, which is a measurement of work over a period of time. Horsepower in its simplest form equals torque in foot-pounds times RPM divided by 5252, which is a constant to get all the units to jive together. And since an engine operates in a power band between idle and maximum safe RPM, below 5252 RPM torque will exceed horsepower. At 5252 RPM, torque and horsepower will be equal, and above 5252 RPM, horsepower will exceed torque. At this point, usually the question arises, which is more important, torque or horsepower? Well, neither is more important since they are interconnected and they explain the same force in two different perspectives. Simply put, torque is how hard it twists, and horsepower is how fast it can twist that hard. Before 1972, the measurement and advertisement of output of American engines was standardized by the Society of Automotive Engineers into a version called SAE gross horsepower, which rated the engine with no external accessories, unrestricted tubular exhaust headers, no mufflers, and spark timing on the verge of detonation. They made incredible power figures, but were very misleading since after installed in the car and sold at the dealership with an air cleaner, water and power steering pump, air conditioning, exhaust manifolds, and full exhaust, they could lose as much as 100 horsepower from the gross rating. Inconsistencies were rampant amongst engines. Cars like the Pontiac GTO Judge had Pontiac executives freely admitting the 370 horsepower Ram Air 4 engine was underrated to satisfy the head office of General Motors and insurance companies. This would get the attention of California lawmakers, and in 1970 they would pass a law that any reference to engine horsepower in advertisements, sales material, and technical literature by 1972 had to be the as-installed SAE net rating, not the gross rating, meaning the days of manufacturers overstating and understating power figures were numbered. The new SAE net rating system more accurately reflected stock ignition timing, fuel and air delivery, exhaust systems, and accessories, which had an immediate result with dramatic drops in advertised power. Combined with more stringent emissions regulations, advertised horsepower ratings plummeted 40% on average, putting an end to the horsepower arms race that dominated the late 60s and early 70s. While American power plants remained pretty mundane throughout the 80s, with the exception of Buick engineers playing with turbochargers in the Regal, Japanese automakers were fully embracing turbocharging, fuel injection, fancy ECUs, and lots of power. By 1988, Japan's road fatalities reached an alarming figure of over 10,000 annually, causing the Japanese Automobile Manufacturers Association, which included Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Mazda, and Mitsubishi, to agree to limit outputs to 280 metric horsepower, which was identical to the most powerful Japanese sports car at the time, the Nissan 300ZX Twin Turbo. This gentleman's agreement was successful in limiting advertised horsepower in Japan, but when imported to the United States and tested under the SAE net standards, the VG30 DETT engine powering the 300ZX made closer to 304 metric horsepower, 24 horsepower higher than originally advertised. These blatant underrating of outputs were rampant across Japanese manufacturers. The Mitsubishi GTO, which advertised 280 metric horsepower, had domestic twins, the 3000 GT VR4, and Dodge Stealth RT, which made 324 metric horsepower with the same 6G72 twin-turbo V6. Toyota was in on the game with the A80 Super Turbo, Honda with the NSX. All showed obvious underreporting when compared to their respective USDM counterparts. By the early 2000s, the popularity of tuner culture had reached ungodly levels, to the point where performance tuning shops were opening all across the United States. One of the specialty tools these shops use and still use today are chassis dynamometers. These machines measure torque output at the wheels and RPM of the engine to calculate horsepower and torque at the wheels during wide open throttle operation. If you place a 300 horsepower SAE net rated car on a chassis dynamometer, by the time that power is transmitted through the transmission's internal drag and frictional losses, driveline bearings and inertia, even the inertia of wheels and tires, the end result can be measured as low as 220 wheel horsepower. And in all-wheel drive configurations with another differential and drive shaft worth of inertial losses, it can get even lower. Many enthusiasts, after being heartbroken seeing their 300 horsepower rated car measuring 220 at the wheels, will typically use a conversion factor known as the 15-20 rule, 15% loss for manual cars and 20% loss for automatic cars, to back measure the flywheel horsepower, which is pretty inaccurate. Since frictional losses increase as more torque is made, as the load on the bearings and the driveline is more intense, a universal linear correction factor is less and less accurate the more power you make. In rare cases, there are cars that defy physics of drivetrain loss, on paper at least, and put down the same horsepower to the wheels they were rated at the crankshaft. The 2000 Camaro Z28 is one example, regularly putting down 295 to 310 horsepower to the wheels on chassis dynamometers, but the LS1 engine inside was advertised at 305 SAE net, making it seem as if drivetrain loss is non-existent. Owners quickly caught on, and the more than likely explanation was since the same engine was available in the C5 Corvette and rated at 345 horsepower, the Camaro would seem like the better option, taking away sales from the Corvette as it was cheaper and just as powerful. BMW has a long history of questionable numbers in their turbocharged engines, regularly matching if not exceeding its SAE net rating at the wheels in vehicles with the B58, S63, and S58 engines. While there is German standardization for engine testing detailed in the DIN 70020, which closely matches the SAE 1349 testing procedure, the exact procedure BMW uses is obviously trade secrets, but more than likely they test their engines completely heat-soaked and publish the lowest numbers recorded to not overstate claims. The result is, when tested in the real world in cooler conditions and denser air, they make considerably more power than advertised and regularly exceed performance figures published from the factory.
Not the best off the line there, cock that up a bit and he's going to get me.
Porsche and McLaren are very good examples of this, with the 911 Turbo S commonly demolishing its performance figures posted in brochures, and the McLaren 765 LT making damn near its net horsepower rating at the wheels. But why? why not advertise the maximum performance to help promote their cars and make headlines? Well, you're probably going to make headlines, but not in a positive way. For example, in 1999, Ford marketed the Mustang Cobra at 320 horsepower SAE net, which was 15 horsepower more than the previous year. But when owners compared performance and dyno figures, it didn't live up to the figures promised, and after owners raised absolute hell, Ford recalled 5300 Cobras to get a mandatory high-flow intake, catback exhaust, and ECU calibration, rectifying the issue. It would even reach the state of Florida's Attorney General office, who launched a formal investigation into alleged false advertising by Ford. It's safe to say the reason many German brands, McLaren and others, understate is simply the fact that they would rather journalist columns and headlines say, "Insert brand underrated horsepower," or "You're probably getting more power for your money," rather than "Insert brand is ripping you off." In this age of quickly consumed media and ever-decreasing attention spans, the reverence on horsepower and torque numbers has gotten slightly out of control, as it's the first thing that gives someone reading or watching an idea of what a car is capable of. Whether you have 150 or 1500 horsepower, both will move you forward. So next time you're on a dyno and wondering where all the power went, it's there, you just can't see it.